moments in our lives that seem so small while they're happening that we almost miss them entirely. They don't arrive with lightning striking the ground or some booming voice announcing that everything is about to change. More often than not, they begin quietly. A familiar room, a well-worn ritual, the same candle you've lit countless times before. If you'd asked me before this week what today's meditation was going to be about, I probably would have shrugged and I didn't have any expectations. It was just another morning, another chance to sit with myself for a few minutes before moving into the rest of my day. Looking back now, I don't think that meditation was ever about meditation. I think it simply became the doorway through which I stumbled into a much bigger conversation. My practice that morning looked almost identical to so many that had come before it. I lit my altar candle, and the familiar scent of myrrh incense began filling the room. Then I sat down in my rocking chair beneath the copper pyramid I've been experimenting with, closed my eyes, and began breathing slowly. There was no music playing in the background, and no guided voice leading me anywhere. It was simply me, the gentle rhythm of the rocking chair, my breath moving in and out, and the quiet presence of a space that has become deeply sacred to me over time. Nothing about the setting suggested that anything extraordinary was about to happen, which is often how the most meaningful experiences begin. For years, I've returned to the same simple mantra whenever I find myself needing to soften. I can't remember the exact wording I used that morning, but it was something along the lines of, I give in, I allow whatever happens to happen, I release control. Those words weren't new to me. In fact, they were incredibly familiar. What was different, though, was not the mantra itself. It was the way I related to them. So many times in the past, I had repeated those words almost like I was trying to convince myself they were true. I would say I was surrendering while quietly trying to force surrender to happen. Looking back, it's almost funny to realize I had spent years trying to control the very experience of letting go. Within only a couple of minutes, I noticed something beginning to build inside me. It wasn't a thought, and it wasn't an emotion in the way we usually think about emotions. It was more of a sensation, a pressure, kind of like an energy gathering in my chest around my heart center, growing stronger with each passing breath. Along with it came an overwhelming urge to smile, laugh, and to simply allow whatever this was to move through me. It felt deeply pleasurable, almost euphoric even. Yet at the very same time, there was something inside me that wanted to pull back. The feeling was becoming intense enough that I could sense another part of myself quietly reaching for the steering wheel. And then something happened that at first seemed almost insignificant. The feeling stopped growing. It didn't disappear, but it plateaued. As I sat there, I realized I'd begun trying to recreate what had happened during my meditation the week before. My mind wasn't racing exactly. It wasn't really loud or chaotic. It was much subtler than that. There was this almost imperceptible strain, that this effort to make the experience deepen, to understand it while it was happening, to even compare it to last week, to explain it, to give it words before it had even finished unfolding. I wasn't running away from the experience, I was trying to shape it. The strange thing is that I had entered the meditation with a mantra about surrender, yet somewhere along the way I had quietly picked control back up without even noticing. I was still repeating the words, but they had become effort instead of invitation. They had become something I was trying to accomplish instead of something I was allowing. The moment I recognized that, I made a conscious decision that felt surprisingly simple. I stopped trying to force anything. I let my body relax more deeply into the chair. My breathing settled naturally instead of being managed. Even the mantra changed. It stopped feeling like something I was saying and started feeling more like breathing itself, gently drifting in and out of my awareness without any effort at all. Almost immediately, the sensation surged again. It rose through my chest with an intensity that is honestly difficult to put into words. The pleasure became stronger than before, but so did the uncertainty. It felt almost unbearable, not because it was painful, but because I didn't know where it would end if I simply allowed it to continue. There was fear woven into the experience, and not fear that something evil was happening or that I was somehow spiritually unsafe, but fear of what would happen if I stopped trying to contain it. It was as though my entire nervous system was asking, how much of this are you really willing to feel? In that moment, I realized that sometimes even joy can feel terrifying when you've spent a lifetime believing that feeling anything too deeply could one day be used against you. That realization stayed with me long after the meditation ended. As someone with a long history of trauma, control has often masqueraded as safety in my life. It made perfect sense once. It was how my nervous system survived abandonment, grief, abuse, and countless countless experiences where losing control genuinely was dangerous. There were seasons of my life where hypervigilance wasn't irrational at all. It was adaptive. It was intelligent. It was the best my mind and body knew how to do in order to protect me. But what once protected us can quietly become the very thing that keeps us from fully living. And I began wondering whether that same pattern had followed me somewhere I never expected to find it. What if the hardest part of meditation isn't learning to sit in silence? What if the hardest part is surrendering the belief that we should control what silence gives us? Because maybe that's what I had been doing all along. Maybe I wasn't struggling to meditate because my mind was busy or because I couldn't sit still. Maybe I was struggling because every part of me had been trained to believe that safety comes from managing the experience before it has a chance to unfold. And if that's true, then perhaps this conversation isn't really about meditation at all. Perhaps meditation simply held up a mirror, revealing something that has quietly shaped far more of my life than I ever realized. The more I realized, I wasn't content to remain inside the walls of my meditation practice. It began showing up everywhere. I started mentally walking through different areas of my life, almost as if someone had handed me a new lens and invited me to look again. One by one, experiences that had always seemed disconnected suddenly began to share the same thread. The common denominator wasn't meditation, it wasn't spirituality, it wasn't even trauma, it was control. More specifically, it was the countless ways I had mistaken control for safety. The difficult part about that realization is that control rarely announces itself as control. It doesn't usually sound like someone saying, "I need to dominate every situation." Instead, it disguises itself as responsibility, preparation, wisdom, discernment, or even healing. It whispers that if we just think a little harder, prepare a little better, analyze one more angle, or predict one more outcome, then maybe nothing will catch us off guard again. There's an understandable logic to that, especially for those of us whose lives have taught us that the unexpected can be deeply painful. Our nervous systems become convinced that if we can just stay one step ahead of life, maybe life won't be able to hurt us anymore. The tragedy is that while control often promises safety, it rarely delivers peace. As I reflected on my own life, I realized I couldn't honestly talk about control without talking about trauma. I don't say that because I believe everyone listening has experienced trauma in the same way that I have, nor do I think trauma is the only reason people struggle with surrender. It is simply my story, and my story has shaped the way I meet the world. When you're abandoned by your birth mother as a young child, lose a parent you love at an early age, endure abuse, survive sexual assault, and spend years in an emotionally abusive relationship, your nervous system learns some very specific lessons. One of those lessons is that losing control can be dangerous. Another is that strong emotions often come with consequences. If being fully yourself has repeatedly been met with rejection, criticism, or harm, then of course you learn to tighten your grip. Of course you begin trying to anticipate every possible outcome before it arrives. Even growing up in an environment where my emotions often felt like they were too much reinforced that lesson. I learned, consciously or not, that there were acceptable ways to express myself and unacceptable ways to express myself. I became very good at monitoring my internal world before anyone else had the chance to respond to it. Looking back, I don't feel anger toward the younger version of myself for doing that. I feel compassion. She wasn't trying to make life difficult. She was simply trying to survive. She developed an incredibly sophisticated system for staying emotionally safe, and for a long time, it probably did exactly what it needed to do. The problem is that survival strategies don't always know when the danger is past. They continue doing the job they were created to do, even when the environment has changed. Hypervigilance doesn't wake up one morning and decide its work is finished. Control doesn't voluntarily hand back the keys just because we're finally surrounded by people who love us. It continues scanning, predicting, preparing, and tightening because that's what it has always believed safety requires. The irony is, the very thing designed to protect us can slowly become the thing that keeps us from experiencing the fullness of our own lives. It doesn't just protect us from pain. It protects us from wonder, intimacy, joy, creativity, vulnerability, and every other experience that requires us to loosen our grip. And that realization made me think back to something we talked about in last week's episode when we explored labels in witchcraft. witchcraft. We discussed how human beings naturally create labels because they help us make sense of a world that often feels messy and uncertain. Again, labels aren't inherently bad. They're quite useful. They help us communicate, organize information, and navigate incredibly complex experiences. But we also acknowledge that healing often begins when we realize that life refuses to stay inside the neat little boxes we've created for it. The moment we insist that reality must fit our categories, reality has a funny way of reminding us that it is always bigger than our understanding. Labels and control might actually be far more closely related than I had ever considered. Why do we create labels in the first place? Part of the answer, I think, is because labels give us a sense of certainty. If I can define something, categorize it, and place it neatly on a shelf in my mind, then I feel like I understand it. Understanding feels safe. Predictability feels safe. We don't just label plants, emotions, spiritual experiences, or people because it's practical. Sometimes we label them because uncertainty makes us uncomfortable. The label becomes less about communication and more about the illusion that we've finally gotten our hands around something that was never meant to fit neatly inside our definitions. As I sat with that thought, another realization quietly emerged, one that honestly caught me off guard. During my meditation, I'd been doing the exact same thing. The moment the sensations became unfamiliar, my mind immediately wanted to name them, compare them to last week's experience, explain them, and understand what they meant before they had even finished unfolding. In other words, I wanted to put the experience into a box while I was still inside it. I wanted certainty before I had allowed mystery to complete its sentence. The feelings didn't plateau because I had done anything wrong. They plateaued because I'd unconsciously exchanged participation for observation. Instead of simply living the experience, I had stepped outside of it to narrate it. That has made me wonder how often we do that outside of meditation as well. How many moments of our lives have we interrupted because we were too busy explaining them while they were still happening? How many conversations have we analyzed instead of fully listening? How many relationships have we tried to predict instead of experiencing? How many emotions have we rushed to diagnose before allowing ourselves to simply feel them? Maybe one of the greatest losses isn't that we don't understand enough. Maybe it's that we're so busy trying to understand life that we forget to participate in it. And if that's true, then meditation didn't teach me something entirely new that morning. It simply revealed a pattern that had been quietly shaping the way I moved through the world all along. Once I began seeing that pattern, I couldn't stop seeing it. It wasn't confined to my meditation practice anymore. It appeared in my work, in my relationships, in my healing, and perhaps most surprisingly, it appeared in my spiritual life. Because spirituality is often the place where we believe we've escaped our old patterns. We assume that because we're praying instead of worrying, or meditating instead of doom scrolling, or casting a spell instead of spiraling, we've somehow left our fear behind. But what if we haven't? What if we've simply given fear a more spiritual vocabulary? What if control doesn't disappear when we begin a spiritual practice? What if it simply learns to wear ritual robes? That was an uncomfortable question for me to ask because I love witchcraft. I love ritual. I love spell work. My practice has become one of the most healing parts of my life, and I would never want this conversation to suggest otherwise. In fact, I think witchcraft has been one of the greatest tools I've ever found for healing my nervous system, rebuilding my relationship with myself, and cultivating a life filled with intention. So when I found myself wondering whether spellcraft could sometimes become another expression of control, I also knew I had to be careful. I didn't want to throw out something sacred simply because it could be misunderstood or misused. After all, almost anything in life can become unhealthy if we approach it from a place of fear. So I started asking myself a different question. What is witchcraft? If not an attempt to influence reality? At first, that question almost sounded dangerous. Isn't that exactly what spellcraft is? Aren't we trying to create change? Aren't we directing energy toward a desired outcome? The more I sat with it, however, the more I realized there was another distinction hiding beneath the surface, one I had never consciously put into words before. There is an enormous difference between influence and control. Those two ideas may look similar from a distance, but they are rooted in entirely different ways of relating to the world. Think about gardening for a moment. When you plant a seed, water it faithfully, enrich the soil, and pull the weeds around it, you are absolutely influencing what happens. You're participating. You're creating conditions where life can flourish, but you aren't controlling the seed. You can't command it to germinate tomorrow morning. You can't negotiate with the weather. You can't force the sun to shine or the rain to fall at exactly the right time. You do your part with care and intention, and then at some point you have to trust the process. The garden is a relationship, not a machine. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized that healthy witchcraft feels much more like tending a garden than operating a vending machine. Sometimes we unconsciously approach magic as though inserting the correct ingredients should guarantee a particular result. We gather the herbs, choose the candle color, recite the incantation, and then quietly expect reality to comply because we followed the recipe correctly. But relationship has never worked that way. I don't think that's how relationships with people work, and I certainly don't think it's how relationships with the sacred work. If my practice has taught me anything, it's that the deepest moments have almost never come because I successfully controlled the outcome. They've come because I was willing to participate without demanding certainty. And that completely changed the way I began thinking about spellcraft. Perhaps the difference isn't whether we're practicing witchcraft, it's how we're practicing witchcraft. You can cast a protection spell because you're terrified and trying to eliminate every possible risk. You can convince yourself that if you perform enough rituals, buy enough crystals, cleanse often enough, and create enough wards, you'll finally become untouchable. Underneath all of those actions is a nervous system desperately searching for certainty. The ritual may look beautiful from the outside, but internally it is fueled by fear. Or you can cast that very same protection spell because it reminds your nervous system that you are supported, connected, prepared, and capable of meeting whatever comes. The herbs become companions rather than weapons. The candle becomes a symbol of your intention instead of a demand placed upon the universe. The ritual becomes a conversation rather than a command. Outwardly, the spell might look almost identical. Inwardly, everything has changed. One is rooted in fear, while the other is rooted in trust. The same thing is true of manifestation, prosperity work, healing spells, or prayers offered to a deity. We can approach them with clenched fists, convinced that our job is to make one specific future happen exactly as we imagined it, or we can approach them with open hands. We can say, this is what I hope for. This is the direction I'm walking. This is the intention I'm setting. I'm going to participate fully while remaining open to outcomes I can't yet see. That isn't passivity. It isn't giving up. It's partnership. It recognizes that while our actions matter deeply, they are part of something larger than our own ability to orchestrate reality. And as those thoughts settled, I realized they'd quietly led me back to the very word that sits at the heart of this podcast: sovereignty. It's a word we hear often, but I think many of us misunderstand what it actually means. We tend to associate sovereignty with absolute authority, complete independence, or having total command over our lives. We imagine kings sitting on thrones, rulers issuing decrees, people who possess unquestioned control over everything around them. The older I've become and the deeper my own healing has gone, the less convincing that definition feels. Because true sovereignty may be less about domination and more about remaining rooted enough to meet what comes without needing to manipulate it into something safer. There's one distinction I feel is incredibly important to make before we go any further. Because whenever we begin talking about surrender, especially as people with trauma histories, the conversation can become dangerous if we're not careful. Surrender is not the same thing as giving up. It is not tolerating abuse. It is not abandoning healthy boundaries, silencing your intuition, or remaining in situations that are actively causing you harm. For many of us, those things were never choices to begin with. They were circumstances we endured because we didn't have the power, resources, or safety to choose differently. Calling that surrender would diminish the reality of what so many people have survived. True surrender can only exist where there is genuine choice. It is something we freely offer, never something taken from us. That distinction matters because there is a world of difference between powerlessness and trust. Powerlessness says, I have no say in what happens to me. Trust says, I don't know exactly what will happen, but I trust myself to meet it. Those two statements may sound similar on the surface because both acknowledge uncertainty, but they are born from entirely different places. One is rooted in helplessness, the other is rooted in sovereignty. One believes uncertainty means danger, while the other believes uncertainty is simply part of being alive. Learning that difference has become one of the most healing parts of my own journey, because for so many years I confused gripping tighter with becoming stronger, when in reality I was exhausting myself trying to hold together a future that had never been mine to control. Looking back at my meditation now, I don't actually think the breakthrough happened because I found the right mantra. It wasn't because I was sitting beneath a copper pyramid or because the incense happened to be myrrh. It wasn't even because I reached some extraordinary spiritual state. The moment everything shifted was much quieter than that. It happened when I stopped pretending to trust the process and actually trusted it. Those may sound like the same thing, but they aren't. Before that moment, I was saying words about surrender while secretly trying to manage the experience. I was still holding the steering wheel with white knuckles while telling myself I had let go. The instant I noticed that, relaxed my body, and allowed the mantra to drift through my mind instead of forcing it forward, something inside me softened. The experience didn't become less intense. If anything, it became more intense. The difference was that I had stopped resisting it. And I don't think that realization only applies to meditation. I think about how often I've approached life the exact same way. How many times have I told myself I had accepted something while quietly replaying every possible outcome in my mind? How often have I convinced myself I trusted Hekate while secretly trying to interpret every sign, every dream, every coincidence so I could feel more certain about where I was headed? How many spells have I released with my hands while still gripping them in my heart? I don't ask those questions from a place of shame. I ask them because I think they're deeply human. We all want reassurance. We all want certainty. We all want to believe that if we do enough, know enough, or prepare enough, then maybe life won't surprise us anymore. But life has never asked to eliminate surprise. It has only asked us to participate. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you've probably noticed that many of our conversations have circled around different topics. We've talked about labels, devotion, fear, technology, trauma, witchcraft, and healing. On the surface, those episodes may have seemed unrelated. But sitting here now, I honestly don't think they were. I think they've all been different faces of the same conversation. Labels can become attempts to control uncertainty. Perfectionism can become an attempt to control uncertainty. Hypervigilance can become an attempt to control uncertainty. Even our spiritual practices can become attempts to control uncertainty if we're not paying attention to the consciousness underneath them. The practices themselves aren't the problem. The question is always the same. Am I participating in relationship or am I trying to guarantee an outcome? That question has become one I want to carry into every part of my life. When I sit down to meditate, am I trying to manufacture an experience or am I making myself available to one? When I cast a spell, am I trying to bend reality to my will or am I entering into relationship with my intention, my practice, my gods, and the mystery that none of us can fully understand? When I experience grief, joy, fear, or love, am I immediately trying to explain it, categorize it, and place it into a box? Or can I allow myself to experience it before I decide what it means? None of those questions have perfect answers, and maybe that's exactly the point. Life has never fit neatly into our categories, no matter how desperately we wish it would. If I leave you with anything today, I hope it isn't another rule to follow or another spiritual technique to master. I hope it's simply a question that stays with you long after this episode ends. Where in your life have you mistaken control for safety? Not because I want you to abandon wisdom, preparation, or discernment. Those things have their place, and they always will. But perhaps there are moments where the grip has become so tight that it is no longer protecting you. Perhaps there are places where your nervous system is still fighting battles that ended years ago. Perhaps there are experiences waiting to unfold that can only emerge when you stop trying to narrate them into existence and instead allow yourself to participate in them. And maybe that's what Hekate has been trying to teach me all along. Not how to control the crossroads, not how to guarantee which road will be easiest, not how to make every spell unfold exactly the way I imagined, but how to stand at the crossroads anyway. Lantern in hand, heart open, rooted in myself, willing to choose a direction, and trusting that whatever I meet there, I will be capable of meeting it. Because maybe that is what sovereignty has been all along. Not control, but trust. And maybe that's what witchcraft has always invited us into. Not the art of controlling reality, but the art of consciously participating in it. We light the candle, we gather the herbs, we whisper the prayer, we make the offering, we cast the spell, we take the next step, we do our part with intention, presence, and devotion, and then we release what was never ours to command in the first place. That isn't weakness. It isn't passivity. It isn't giving away our power. It is choosing to place our power where it has always belonged, not in controlling the world around us, but in how we choose to meet it. And perhaps that is the greatest act of sovereignty any of us will ever practice. Until next time, honor the truth that keeps you sovereign.